Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder and violence.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us with this week's cheat sheet. We're going to be talking about the murder of Rachel Morin.
Also be discussing the murders of Jared Bridegan and Dan Markel.
We'll be discussing Dennis Rader, a.k.a. the BTK serial killer, and some recent updates in his case.
Also, there's been some recent updates in the University of Idaho murder case, which we will be discussing.
Lastly, we'll be getting into the murder of Marion County Sheriff's Deputy John Durm, which happened in Indianapolis this past year. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Cheat Sheet, Trials and Transports. So to kick off, we'll be discussing the case of Rachel Morin. This is a mom of 5 in Maryland who was out for a walk or a jog on the Ma and Pa Trail in Bel Air, Maryland, and she was unfortunately murdered. Now, Harford County Sheriff's Office, which is the lead agency on this case, they have a DNA match to their suspect. This suspect they note to be 5'9", 160 pounds. He's early to mid-20s. He's a Hispanic male. We know that he assaulted a young child during a home invasion in Los Angeles in March. So this person is basically doing a nationwide crime spree. And Harford County Sheriff Jeff Gaylor told the local Fox affiliate, "This individual poses a threat to every community from here to Los Angeles because we don't know where he's laying his head at night." Look at this video of this person. You can kind of see his profile. You can see him from behind. It's important that this person is found because he's obviously preying on the vulnerable.
And there's a lot of concern that if he's not caught relatively soon, he might have other victims.
Absolutely. And if you recognize this person, we're going to include a court TV link, so you're going to be able to look at the video again and again. Check it out. If you recognize him, please call the sheriff's office in Maryland at 410-836-7738 or shoot them an email at rmtips@harfordsheriff.org. That's HARFORDSHERIFF.org. And remember, they don't need to hear from you about like what DNA they should use. They already know that. They've got the guy. Just only people who may have a lead on where this person is.
Let's talk about the latest in the murder of Jared Bridegan. This, of course, was a Microsoft executive who was murdered back in February of 2022 in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. He had taken his children there to visit his ex-wife.
Yeah, he's taking his twins, who he shares with his ex-wife, Shanna Gardner Fernandez. And it's just supposed to be a family visit. He drops them off. He's driving with his 2-year-old that he shares with his new wife. And somebody puts a tire in the road. He gets out, presumably to move it, and is gunned down. So police are looking at this. This could be a targeted hit going after him specifically. And they have basically rounded up 3 people in connection with this, including Mario Fernandez, Shanna Gardner Fernandez's husband, and now recently, Shanna Gardner Fernandez. So one development that came out is Fox News Digital exclusively obtained body camera footage showing the arrest of Shanna Gardner Fernandez in Washington. And you can hear her 12-year-old twins talking in the background. You're seeing her get cuffed and walked out. You're seeing her mother, Shelly Gardner, who is, of course, the co-founder of Stampin' Up, a notable Utah multi-level marketing scheme, crying in the background. It's very dramatic. I know one person asked us recently a good question about extradition. That's become a wrinkle here because she's getting arrested in Washington. She's wanted in Florida. So what happens now? they noted that, Brian Kohberger, the suspect in the Idaho murders
And of course,
case.
we'll be talking about him a little bit later.
Yeah.
He was arrested in one state and then is taken back to Idaho relatively quickly.
Yeah, Pennsylvania to Idaho.
And this happens in his case very quickly, certainly more quickly than what seems to be going on in this case.
And the reason for that is he waived extradition.
Yeah.
He didn't fight it. He just said, all right, take me back to Idaho.
And there's different strategic reasons for why a person might want to make the courts go through the extradition process, or there's also strategic reasons why maybe you don't want to bother. But the important thing is generally speaking, if one state wants to extradite somebody from another state, that happens.
There's a whole provision for this in the U.S. Constitution. There's a whole extradition clause, and it basically...
It says basically there's only a handful of reasons why one state can deny extradition of a fugitive to another state.
Yeah, governors, in this day and age, governors' hands are essentially tied. There's 4 circumstances that I'll read out quickly. Otherwise, you got to send the person. So, 1, the extradition documents are not in order. The state messed up. And
so that makes sense. Very little gets done in government if the paperwork is not in order.
Yes, and here's another.
And apparently that was even an issue back in the era in which we wrote the Constitution.
Yes. 2, the person has not been charged with the crime, so I can't just be the governor of Indiana. Kevin's out there in New York, and I can't just say, New York, bring him to me. Well, what did he do? Nothing, but I need to talk to him quickly. They're not going to do that.
Number 3, the person is not the person named in the extradition document.
Yeah, that would obviously be a problem.
So, like, if they want to extradite Anya from New York and it has my name on the document, that's not good enough.
No, can't do it. And then the other one is the person is not a fugitive. So I guess that would also kind of indicate that they haven't been charged with anything. You can't be a fugitive if you're not charged. So based on that, extraditions are pretty much honored between the states. And in Shanna Gardner Fernandez's case, she seems to be potentially fighting extradition. So that can delay things a bit. Can delay things certainly more than if you just waive it. But I suppose we'll see what happens going forward. One case that we sort of were discussing recently that bears a few, at least on the surface, similarities to Jared Bridegan's case was the murder of Dan Markel. So Markel was a Canadian-born attorney. He was Harvard educated. That's where he got his JD from. He was a law professor. So he was a very prominent figure. Now, on July 18th, 2014, he is gunned down at his home in Tallahassee, Florida. He didn't die immediately, but he died the following day. Basically, from the beginning, the Tallahassee Police Department indicated that they felt there was a plot against him. This was not some robbery gone wrong. They felt that he was targeted. Now, the reason we bring it up in context of the Jared Bridegan case is that there were child custody issues between Dan Markel and his ex-wife, Wendy Adelson, who was also a law professor, who was actually working at Florida State University when this all happened. Police have named her, along with her brother Charlie, her mother Donna, as conspirators in the killing. That being said, Wendy has not yet been tried. Charlie, that being said, was arrested, and his trial is scheduled for October of this year. So there's going to be a few things coming up on the horizon with that. But the things that stood out to me are you have a very prominent man, and Jared Bridegan was a successful Microsoft executive. You have, and this person was a very prominent law professor and an attorney. You have Florida, and you have a conspiracy. It's not just one person who gets the idea, I want to kill this person. The cops are alleging in both cases that it's a wider conspiracy with people assigned different roles and there being motivations that stem from some sort of child custody dispute. So it's somewhat interesting. Whenever we're looking at cases, we try to see, is there any sort of precedent for this? Is this a really unusual case? Or is it somewhat unusual, but perhaps there's some parallels with other cases? And this was one that we found and that stood out to us. And it's also interesting because at least the former brother-in-law is certainly facing charges soon.
That's the only one we'll be keeping an eye on. I believe he's facing a trial as soon as October.
Yes, that's right. He was arrested in April of 2022. So, and he's been hit with first-degree murder and conspiracy charges. So Wendy and Donna, aka the victim's ex-wife and former mother-in-law, have been named as co-conspirators. So that's not just Kevin and I speculating. The police are coming out and saying that. They're not being charged, though. So, that kind of tells you where the evidence points to in terms of what they feel they have a strong case for. Bouncing on to an old case with some new developments.
This is the case of Dennis Rader,
aka BTK. I don't really like referring to him as BTK because that's the name he gave himself. I prefer to call him by his real name.
Let's call him Dennis Rader.
Yeah, because he's a loser. So he murdered 10 people in Kansas.
He murdered at least 10 people.
At least 10 people. He murdered at least 10 confirmed victims in Kansas, specifically Wichita and Park City. And he was actually active as a serial killer between the years of 1974 and 1991. So, quite a run. We've talked about this on the cheat sheet before, but rather hilariously turned himself into police by basically having some sort of communication where he says, "Can you track me if I send you like a floppy disk?" And they were like, no. And then he sent it and then they tracked him. So, not the criminal genius he certainly thought he was. So why are we talking about him? Well, why don't you lay it on us, Kevin?
Police are investigating the possibility that he may have been involved in a couple of other disappearances.
And murders.
In 1976, a 16-year-old cheerleader named Cynthia Kinney disappeared. That case was reopened just back in December, and Rader has been named as a prime suspect in that case.
Yeah, there's an interesting connection there, but it's also one that I am frankly a little bit skeptical of.
Why is that?
I did some digging on the case of Cynthia Kinney. So she's the 16-year-old. She's, by all accounts, very well adjusted, very happy, has friends. She's really excited because she just made the cheerleading squad. She's, for the summer, working at her aunt and uncle's laundromat in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. And it's June 23rd. She's eating a sweet roll, has her purse there at the laundromat. Witnesses are in the laundromat, and they say that 2 women approach her, and she leaves with them. She's then seen getting into a beige 1965 or 1966 model Plymouth, which is described as being driven by either a young man or 2 men. One thing that's very important for the Rader connection is across the street, there is either an extant bank or a bank that is under construction. Why is that important for Dennis Rader? Well, Dennis Rader, according to the Associated Press's report on this whole recent development, was a ADT technician. So he's a regional installer, and he would have been potentially installing these alarms across the street. Unclear to me from the reports that from the 70s whether, again, the bank was being constructed at the time or whether it was just being remodeled with new alarms and stuff. Now, KAKE-TV locally notes that there's no confirmation at this point that Rader was the one actually installing the systems that day. But what police are looking at is we have this prolific serial killer, potentially right across the street, and then this girl goes missing at the same time. So that seems to be it. Now, what baffles me is then who are these women? Were all the witnesses wrong? Were all the witnesses maybe seeing somebody else leave the laundromat who was not Cynthia? And
eyewitnesses often get things wrong.
We know that eyewitnesses get stuff wrong all the time, even stuff that you would kind of hope they wouldn't get wrong. To be clear, the witnesses didn't say anything like, oh, they came in and threatened her. It was like they said it was very casual. She just walked out. She leaves her sweet roll, which she's already bitten into. She leaves her purse. She never comes back. This happens before 10 a.m. Then apparently around 10 a.m., some of her friends come by to see her. She's already gone. And they were actually so concerned by that they kind of report that she's missing. And it's one of those cases when you're reading the old newspaper clippings, you can tell how much the law enforcement people who worked on it and the prosecutor, like, they were haunted by this. They basically, there was one quote from the prosecutor that was basically like, we know as much about what happened to her as we did 5 minutes after she disappeared. And this is in the 80s. There was one kind of ray of somewhat hope in 1981. Police received a tip, an anonymous tip, and they felt there was enough there where they actually dug up the basement of a local man. But they found nothing and then concluded the tip was false, and he threatened to sue. They kind of ruined his house. He had no connection to her. So they were trying, but they're just getting nowhere. But I would be curious, were they able to cross out some of those witness sightings? Would there be some reason that they could discount that? Or maybe find out that, oh, she was going off with her friends. Although, frankly, one weird thing is that the women who came up to her, one was described as 18 to 20, the other one was around 30, so older. I don't know. The proximity to a bank that he may have been working at is interesting, but I do think it's important to note that Rader, most of the confirmed crimes that he committed were home invasions that led to sexual assaults and murders, not abducting people from stores. I mean, people can switch up their MO. I'm not like that definitely happens. I'm just a little bit baffled by some of the fact that there were multiple witnesses. There's also seemed to be witnesses across the street. I'd wonder about that. What's your take?
I'd be curious about the thing with these cases is that often we know only a fragment of what law enforcement knows. And based on what's out there, I share your doubts and concerns about this and about the chances of it being connected to Rader. But there had to have been something that made them take this step. So I wonder if they have other additional information that they've not yet made public.
One thing I've heard that, I mean, I just have seen over time at different points where, like, well, you know, he admitted to all these different crimes. You know, but, like, let's be, like, this man is not right. Like, I don't think we should just take his word for anything. Like, I'm not one of those people like, well, he admitted all these other ones for whatever sick reasons. People can, you know, people are proven to do horrible things all the time. I don't think we need to necessarily just, like, his word is golden here. There's no way he's holding back. Who knows? There can be any number of reasons for holding back. I just think it doesn't really sound like what he was doing later. Well, then again, if he's not familiar with Oklahoma, I'll say this. If he's not familiar with Oklahoma, maybe he's just like, I'm going to do something different. I don't know. So I go back and forth. I'd be interested to know if they have anything other than him possibly working there. And the other case, we have even less information on. This was a young woman. She was called Grace Doe for years. Her body was found in December of 1990. This is in Missouri, in McDonald County. And she was raped, she was strangled, and she was also restrained with several different types of bindings. And coroner at the time estimated she was there for about 2 months before she was found. So, you know, she would have been killed in, I guess, October of 1990. Now, she was again known as Grace Doe for years until recently, when Othram ran her DNA. They were able to identify her in 2021 as 22-year-old Shanna Beth Gardner. It was really tragic. I saw one obituary of, I suppose, her foster brother, and she's listed in that he died, and she's listed as kind of being a possible survivor, but they note that her address is unknown. That was from the early 2000s. By that time, she was already dead for a decade. So she is the other person being looked at as a possible Rader connection. There's not as much information out about that. They appear to be sort of digging up excavating near Dennis Rader's old home, which has since been demolished in Park City, Kansas. So they're looking for some evidence to corroborate potentially what their theory is.
And while we're on this topic, we should note that Rader's daughter, Carrie Rawson, has put on the service formerly known as Twitter that she has helped out with Osage County law enforcement on this case. She has said publicly that in the past she was a victim of such harassment from her father that she got a no contact order against him. Well, that no contact order was lifted, and she had a couple of visits with her father in an effort to get some information from him about these cases. And so kudos to her for working with law enforcement on this. I'm sure that had to be very, very difficult for her.
So that, unfortunately, is a case, the case of BTK, which is, dragged out for years and was not solved until years after many of the murders occurred, and now is dragging out even more as there may be additional victims, or at least law enforcement will need to rule out Dennis Rader in some of these cases. There was one case that we were observing that we sort of thought might reach a conclusion sooner than later.
Very, very quickly, this is the case of Brian Kohberger, who, of course, has been charged in the quadruple homicide that took place near the University of Idaho last winter. There was a hearing in that case on August 18, 2023. That hearing seemed to largely focus on DNA issues. Namely, the prosecution has said, well, we found Kohberger's DNA on a sheath, a knife sheath that was recovered from the crime scene. Therefore, that links him to the crime. His defense attorneys are saying, well, there's also DNA recovered from that house that has not yet been identified.
But the prosecution is disputing that characterization.
The prosecution is saying, well, we don't know. What the defense is basically asking for reports and some more information about this allegedly unidentified DNA. The prosecution is like, we don't know what you want. We don't really have anything else. And I think it's important to stress that if there is unidentified DNA, this was a house belonging to college students. And those of you who've gone to college know that often in houses where college students live, there's a lot of people going in and out at all hours of the night. That's just part of the lifestyle.
Right. And also, I think what's interesting here, and I think what folks should keep in mind with this case and with just cases in general, is discovery issues can derail a case. So if you're sort of sitting there thinking, maybe the prosecution is hiding it, I'm just going to say, I don't know what's going on here, what the issue is with, the sort of both sides saying something different. But that would be a very stupid strategic move if anybody was hiding something in the discovery process, because cases get thrown out for that.
Yeah.
You can't, if you're the prosecutor, you can't just say, well, this looks bad for us, let's hide it. That's not a good idea if you get caught doing that.
Yeah, if you care,
you're done.
If you care about a case, you're not going to do something like that, because that's a good way to jeopardize the entire case by hiding evidence.
Yeah, that's you get cases thrown out. It's like a very serious charge to be saying they're hiding stuff.
And in fairness, in some cases, sometimes things don't get turned over, but that's often because of a mistake or an oversight. So that was what the hearing on Friday was dominated by.
So yeah, what's the upshot of all this is what's happening.
And basically, the prosecution says we don't have anything. We'll check our labs and stuff again, but there's really nothing else there.
Does it strike you as stalling tactics by the defense?
I'm not going to say that. It's important for the defense to protect the rights of their clients vigorously.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to sit here and say they're stalling. I think if you're a defense attorney and you want to do your job thoroughly, you're going to explore all relevant avenues.
What about the whole situation with his alibi?
Well, his alibi basically is that he spent the night and early morning of the murders driving around by himself, perhaps drinking. That's an interesting alibi to have. Unfortunately, if you're driving by yourself drinking, that means that you don't exactly have people to back up where you are.
I would think an alibi would be person A saw me at this place that was not the house on King Road.
I'm sure that's the sort of alibi any defendant would love to have.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, another point about this alibi is there's also be a hard alibi to disprove.
And it seems like the Latah County Prosecutor's Office, a lot of their hearings and their motions recently were connected to, you need to give us your alibi. We need to be able to look at your alibi. And then you can't have it both ways. You can't have a speedy trial but be delaying giving us things. So Judge John Judge essentially put some sort of deadline in place for Kohberger to hand over a list of witnesses for his alibi.
Another interesting thing is actually, as we alluded to, this trial was scheduled to occur this fall. And so the judge gave a deadline not only for alibis, he gave lots of deadlines for all the numerous things that have to happen in this case before there can be a trial. You know, he put in a deadline. Oh, the discovery has to be done by this date. This has to be done by this date. This has to be done by this date. And anybody who looked at that timeline would have to realize that it is, at the very least, wildly ambitious. And that would be very, very difficult to get all of those things done in the short time that they would have to be done before the trial starts. And so I don't know if there was a cause and effect here, but shortly after the judge released that timeline, Brian Kohberger waived his right to a speedy trial. So the trial is not going to happen this year. That was smart strategically because there's a lot of work that needs to be done before his attorneys will be fully prepared to mount a full, vigorous, and informed defense.
Yeah, the Daily Beast ran a dismal headline. We may have to wait years for Brian Kohberger's quadruple murder trial.
Well, the interesting thing is that actually we might have to wait a lot longer than that for a trial, and actually there might not even be a trial at all because Kohberger's defense team actually filed a motion asking that the indictment against him be dismissed. They said they were doing this because of prosecutorial misconduct.
Whoa. So how serious is that?
Well, the part of the problem is we can't really give a substantive answer to that question because the memo they prepared outlining just what that misconduct was, or rather I should say what that alleged misconduct was, has not been released to the public. And about all we know of that comes from a few lines in the state's response. And the state's response was basically, we need more time to respond to this. And they said the memo in support of this was approximately 109 pages, 49 pages of which was made up of the defendant's arguments, and the balance was made up of various exhibits, which include affidavits and other materials. So
basically, they filed a very long document, and we need some time to look through it and have a substantive response.
Yes. Typically speaking, it's not unusual for motions like this to be filed. Often, they're not granted.
Why is that?
Good defense attorneys will try every avenue open to them to try to win a case. So, of course, lots of defense attorneys will try this because in some cases, well, first of all, in some cases, there really is prosecutorial misconduct. That really does occur. And in some cases, there's other reasons why a case against a client should be dismissed. Maybe the case is really weak.
That can only, typically, though, what you're saying is it's like a defense attorney, for lack of a better word, shooting their shot at like, hey, throw it all out, judge. And if it's really weak, or if there really is some prosecutorial misconduct where, you know, something's gone very wrong, then they actually have a shot of making that happen. But just the fact that they're doing this does not mean that the case against Kohberger is weak or that the prosecutors did anything wrong.
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
Yes, we'd have to judge that once we see what the filings are and what the claims are.
Yes. But the odds are the case will go forward. Before we leave the subject of Kohberger's case, there was yet another filing in this case. You know, everybody who's been following this case has probably seen at least a little bit of it on television, or if not literally on television, via the internet. You've seen little clips from the courtroom. That's because there have been cameras in the courtroom. Now, Kohberger's attorneys are saying, we got to get these cameras out of here.
Oh, no. Media's not going to like that.
And
nor is the viewing public.
And nor is the viewing public. And there's a couple of reasons that they cite. Basically, they say when Judge John Judge allowed these cameras in the courtroom, he issued some directives on rules that were supposed to be followed. And those rules, in their mind, have not been followed. For one thing, cameras were not supposed to focus exclusively on Kohberger. But they argue that there has been a lot of cameras focusing exclusively on Kohberger. And they say this has caused people to talk about body language analysis and other such things that are a distraction.
Listen, I'm going to say this. I think that TikTok body language analysis and true crime stories should be shot directly into the sun. But I think people are going to do whatever with whatever. So I think, I don't know. I mean, there's a high public interest in this case. I think people should be allowed to see the process play out here.
And, you know, you were talking about a headline in the Daily Beast. They actually mentioned the Daily Beast in this filing.
They called them out. They called out the Beast.
Because they said one of these pictures of Kohberger that was taken, they say, in violation of the judge's directive, they say was actually used in a Daily Beast article, which was headlined, "Report says Kohberger's creepiness with women goes back to high school." And they say those sorts of headlines in their mind are prejudicial.
We're going to be talking about gag orders in some future episode, and we're going to get into how the defense actually has some interesting bedfellows in their campaign against the media in this case, and it's actually the prosecution in this case. They're kind of aligned, and the families of the family members of Kaylee Gonsalves and the media are sort of aligned in sort of a bit of a back and forth. So it's interesting to see that. Obviously, on the murder sheet, we support the media and consider ourselves members of the Fourth Estate, I would say. But at the same time, there can be problems with media coverage of true crime, and we're definitely interested in engaging with those issues too.
And at least one of us is an attorney and is sensitive to some of the challenges that attorneys face, and the other issue they raise goes to that. In this motion, they mention that often, because the cameras are focused on Kohberger, the cameras also end up getting focused on the defense table. And this raises the possibility that if defense counsel has any motions or notes or what have you on the table in front of them, that these could be photographed and be presented to people all over the world. So that this causes a distraction to the defense because they need to figure out.
They're hiding their notes, basically.
Yeah, they have to be always aware of hiding their notes.
Yeah, that seems like a fair issue to raise. You know, I mean that's not good. Feels like there's a way to maybe set up a pool system, perhaps, where you know the camera is static and there's angles on Kohberger and other relevant people, and maybe it doesn't need to be, you know, in a position where it could even capture anybody's notes.
Or you could argue that at this point, we've all seen what Kohberger looks like. We don't need that information. Let's just focus on the judge and whoever's speaking.
You're saying get the press out of there. You're throwing them out.
I'm saying let's see.
Shocked.
I'm saying let's find a way if we can balance interests. What we're interested in is if witnesses are testifying or experts are testifying. We're interested in the arguments of the attorneys.
But what will people on TikTok talk about if they can't say Brian Kohberger squinting here means that he's definitely guilty and is a serial killer? We're going to lose that. Jeez.
So that's another reason to do it. I think that's enough for Kohberger for now. Shall we move on?
Yes. So Now we're going to be going back to Indiana to talk about just a very, very sad situation that happened relatively recently in Indianapolis, which is where we're based out of. We've actually gone to the Marion County Community Justice Campus. Sometimes Kevin and I, between the two of us, jokingly refer to it as the Palace of Justice. It's a very large, new, fangled building with like a lot of courtrooms in it. And it's very fancy looking, and it's, just very, it's an interesting place. And we've covered cases that have happened there. But unfortunately, something very bad happened there recently. This was the murder of Marion County Sheriff's Office Deputy John Durm. He had been a deputy for 38 years. So we'll get to him in a moment. But let's go to another man, 34-year-old Orlando Mitchell. So he was an inmate at the Adult Detention Center at the Marion County Justice Campus. What was he held for? Well, it was murder, invasion of privacy, unlawful possession of a firearm by a domestic batterer, and criminal recklessness. He was accused of killing the mother of his child, a woman named Crystal Walton. She had been shot. Witnesses saw this, and as he was arrested, he apparently yelled to law enforcement officers, "I shot that B word," and then later stated, "I shot that B word in the face." So he had a medical appointment on July 10th of this year. He was handcuffed, he was shackled, he had a belly chain on, and Deputy Durm led him through the secured doors of the Justice Campus to basically put him in this prisoner transport van that he had. And where they're parked is called a Sally Port. It's like the secure entrance to the jail part. So they go to Ashkenazi Hospital in Indianapolis. Things go wrong when they pull back in at 11:13 a.m. That time they pull in to the Sally Port once again. Deputy Durm gets out, unlocks the back right door of the van and opens it. Kevin, why don't you read from the probable cause affidavit about what happened next? And it would appear that this was all caught on surveillance.
Deputy Durm grabs a black milk crate and moves it onto the metal step so he can open the inner door of the transport van. Inmate Mitchell steps out of the secure compartment onto the ground and is completely outside of the transport van as Deputy Durm grabs the milk crate to place it on the ground. As Deputy Durm begins to turn, Inmate Mitchell attacks Deputy Durm. Inmate Mitchell raised both of his hands, which were still secured in handcuffs. The handcuffs were connected to his belly chain. However, the belly chain was no longer around Inmate Mitchell's waist. Inmate Mitchell forced the chain over Deputy Durm's head and around his neck. A struggle ensues between Deputy Durm and Mitchell. During the struggle, both fall to the ground, with Deputy Durm trying to get the chain off his neck. Deputy Durm attempts to free himself from the chain around his neck, and this causes Inmate Mitchell to twist around to the front of Deputy Durm. Inmate Mitchell continues to strangle Deputy Durm around the neck with the chain. Inmate Mitchell stays on top of Deputy Durm after Deputy Durm stops moving and becomes unresponsive. At 11:17 a.m., Inmate Mitchell then gets off Deputy Durm, unwraps the chain from around Deputy Durm's neck, and locates a handcuff key on the ground. Inmate Mitchell uses the key to remove the handcuffs around his wrists. Inmate Mitchell then enters the driver's side of Deputy Durm's transport van, backs the van out of the parking spot, and exits the Sally Port.
At that point, one Sergeant Michael Davidson of the Cumberland Police Department, who was there, he saw someone wearing an orange jumpsuit driving the prison transport van and realized nobody wearing an orange jumpsuit should be driving that because that's what inmates at the ADC wear. So he runs back and finds Deputy Durm. Deputy Durm is rushed to Ashkenazi Hospital where he had just been with Mitchell and is unfortunately pronounced dead at 12:19 p.m. So at this point, deputies are giving chase to Mitchell after the alarm is raised. The van ends up going down the 300 block of East Prospect and then crashes right into a utility pole. Mitchell gets grabbed and handcuffed and brought back. So he basically bought himself like a few minutes of freedom by strangling a man. So yeah, it's like a very horrible situation. And the reason I thought it was interesting is because it does indicate some of the dangers of transporting prisoners. And you might be thinking, why are law enforcement officers potentially doing that by themselves? That seems to actually be a common practice. And unfortunately, as per Marion County Sheriff's Office own policies, Deputy Durm should not have been tasked with this by himself. That was a report from Fox 59 that kind of got their hands on some documents that indicated that the internal policies contradicted with what actually happened here. Of course, anyone who's worked for a large institution probably knows that sometimes internal mandates and the needs of maybe understaffing or how to get things done sometimes contradict themselves. But in this case, it unfortunately cost somebody his life, and put him in a very dangerous situation with this inmate. So yeah, this just got me thinking. I know one thing in the recent hearing in the Delphi murders case, in the case against Richard Allen, where Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett was talking about the shortage of manpower up there and how he sometimes does prison transports alone. I think that was shocking to a lot of people because it's like, the person in charge of the department is even having to do this and is, what are the safety issues with that? So this just kind of reminded me that, like, even transporting a prisoner to a hospital visit could be potentially a very risky situation if you don't have enough people to do it. If you don't have at least one other person backing somebody up, then you could get a situation where people could get hurt.
And I think you did some research and found numerous examples of law enforcement personnel who lost their lives while transporting prisoners.
I did. I wanted to kind of see how common this situation can be. So I looked at the Officer Down Memorial page site, which is actually very helpful for looking up historic crimes. It's a website that documents various law enforcement deaths. And I was looking at specific search terms like Sallyport, transport van, prison vehicle, etc. So this is by no means a comprehensive review. Most of the deaths I found actually were automobile accidents, so not homicides, just an accident happening. So I didn't count any of those, anything that was just a horrible tragedy or mistake. But let's go back and forth and kind of just throw out some of the ones that I did find. So the first one was actually from August 13th, 1919 in Indiana. This happened in Vanderburgh County. Special Deputy William H. Engel, he was transporting prisoners to the Indiana Reformatory in New Albany. And basically there was a complicated situation where a friend of one of the murder suspects passed off a pistol. And as they were all getting off the train, that guy shot Engel, and that was his first day at work, but he did die.
Then there was a case back in 1934 of Deputy Sheriff Dave Ham down in Jackson County, Florida. He and 3 other sheriffs were transporting 3 convicts to jail. One of them somehow got his hands on a gun and shot Ham. Now, Ham returned fire, but he accidentally hit a different prisoner altogether. The sheriff was able to step in eventually and stop it all.
So in Nashville, Tennessee, on July 8th, 1944, Sergeant Kenneth Lewis Jacobs of the United States Army Military Police Corps, he and another officer are taking in a soldier for being drunk, and Jacobs is sitting in the front passenger seat of a car that they're transporting him in. The soldier has a knife and ends up stabbing Jacobs in the neck fatally.
Then there was a case of correctional officer Jesus or Jesse Sanchez. This is an incident that happened back in 1972 in California. Sanchez and another officer left Chino's California Institution for Men. 2 cars forced the van they were driving off of the road, at which point they handcuffed both officers and shot them both. Sanchez passed away from his injuries.
I have 2 cases out of Puerto Rico a number of years apart. The first was in 1975. Correctional Officer Irving Gonzalez of the Puerto Rico Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He's transporting a prisoner from the Rio Piedras State Prison to the Bayamon District Courthouse. A trial is going to happen. But this guy pulls out a shank, stabs the officer in the eye, and basically forces the prison trustee, who of course is a prisoner who's like entrusted with helping out, makes him get out of the car and drives off with the wounded officer, who's later found shot to death. And actually, the guy who was involved in that, Juan Ramon Lopez Perez, remains at large. He was never caught. He was caught, but then he escaped. So, a whole complicated thing. And then the next one involving Puerto Rico happened in 1992. Transportation officer Elias Montalvo Rodriguez and juvenile detention officer Jose Lopez Reyes. He's with the Department of Corrections in Puerto Rico as well. So they're both shot while they're transporting a group of juveniles to the Humacao Juvenile Detention Center. Basically, like, vehicles blocked in their vehicle and opened fire.
Back in 2005, in Roane County, Tennessee, correctional officer Wayne Thomas Cotton Morgan was loading some prisoners into a van. One of the prisoners' wives actually drove up and shot the officer in the stomach with a gun, killing him.
So in 2012 in Mobile, Alabama, a police officer named Stephen Dion Green Sr., he is at the county jail and at the Sally Port, actually. And a prisoner slips his hand out of a handcuff, grabs a knife he had hidden in his cell phone armband, and stabbed Officer Green in the neck. He, much like in the Durm case, steals a car and a service weapon. There's a shootout in which this suspect is actually fatally shot.
In 2017, in Pottawatomie County in Iowa, Deputy Sheriff Mark Jason Burbridge was transporting a prisoner back to jail after a court appearance. The inmate somehow was able to conceal the key to his shackles. He got it out. He removed his shackles. He managed to get his hands on a firearm that was in the van, and he shot both deputies. Burbridge died of his wounds.
And this one is a double homicide out of Georgia in 2017. So Sergeant Christopher James Monica and Sergeant Curtis Billou are transporting 33 prisoners between Hancock State Prison and the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. So two of the prisons actually attack them, manage to get a gun from one of them, and then shoot them both.
In 2018, in Wyandotte County, Kansas, Deputy Sheriffs Patrick Roher and Deputy Sheriff Teresa King were transporting a prisoner from a van to an exterior Sally Port. An inmate succeeded in disarming one of the deputies, shot them both. Both of them died of their wounds. One of the deputies managed to shoot back and wound the suspect.
So obviously some very tragic cases there, but it does seem that there are instances where safety protocols break down or something very unexpected happens. There's an ambush, there's a hidden weapon, and prison transports or the transport of prisoners can become pretty dangerous pretty quickly in those situations. So just in the context of some of the discussion about prison transports and jail transports and all that, I just think it's good to have some of that historic context when we're talking about that, especially since something so awful just recently happened here in Indianapolis. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's cheat sheet. We hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. We want to note that this episode contained references to reporting done by the Associated Press, Fox 5, the Idaho Statesman, KAKE-TV, Newsweek, the Officer Down Memorial Page, the Sapulpa Daily Herald, the Tulsa World, and UPI. We'll also be linking to that coverage in our show notes.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.